Alright guys, so this is another tutorial to answer somebody's question on the answer hub, and this particular poster wanted to have an inventory with a specific set of functionality, and I thought the best way to do this would just to have a video tutorial about it. So let me demonstrate what they wanted really quick. So right here I have my inventory, and it has these 5 items. They're grayed out. You can't do anything with these buttons right now. And we are this little sphere here, and these weird looking meshes that you see are actually collectible items. So the first thing that the poster wanted was they didn't want to have a sliding inventory. So if you collect, for example, this item right in front of us, you see item 4 highlights. So it doesn't go into the first slot every time, and it's not creating like a bigger inventory as you go and collect things and adding like little button widgets. Everything is kind of static where it is. So as you can see, I can go around and collect all 5 of these items, and then what they wanted was to be able to actually click on these things and add them to the player character. So if I click item 2, you'll see this thing is now attached to the player character, and then if I click item 2 again, it'll be removed. Click item 3, put something else there, but if I click item 2 while item 3 is still present, they actually get swapped out. So this is the functionality that the poster wanted, because they're having some kind of a character that can swap out wardrobe, clothing, and hats and things like that, and they were having trouble figuring this out. So now I'm going to show you guys how I did this, and if you have any questions about making inventories or you want to modify something that you see in here, just shoot me a message or leave a comment, and I'll see what I can do to help you guys out. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to need is we're going to need an inventory widget, right? So I'm not actually going to go over how to create these things from scratch. If you want that, like I said, just leave a comment if you need help. This is really geared towards answering how to make this specific type of inventory that the person wanted. So a lot of this is going to be customized, however they want, and they already have a functioning inventory. So I just had to create this so that I can demonstrate this functionality. Okay, so you have your buttons here. These are the 5 items that the poster wanted to have or whatever, and they're just right here. And you go into your graph, and the first thing I'm going to do, since they don't want these buttons to change what item they're displaying, you want it to be static. So what I'm going to do is actually hard code which actors or which items are where. And I'm going to do that by making an item array. This is just what I called it, item array. And I made 5 slots, one for each of the buttons. And you can see that each slot down here in the default value says master item child 1. And number 2 says master item child 2. So each one of these is a specific actor. And I created a parent class. And that's the important thing, to have a parent-child relationship for this. And I'll show you guys why in a minute. So create this array and put in all the items that you want to have, 1 through however many it is. Then we're going to need to cast to the player character. This is important because we want this inventory to be able to talk to the player character. So we're going to need to get a reference to the player character. So we're going to need this casting. And then I have a collected items array. So this is an array of integers, and you'll see why this is important a little bit later when I go into the parent blueprint for the items. You'll see what we use this for. And the last thing that I'm going to do is create an array of all the buttons. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want an easy way to access all of the buttons and to set whether they're enabled or not. So in the beginning I want them all to be disabled because we haven't collected any items yet. So I just grabbed each one of my buttons from here and put them into an array, called it button array, and then when we start off the inventory I'm looping through each one of them and making sure they're disabled here. Alright, the next thing that we want to do is to get functionality for the buttons. So for each button, if you click on it, scroll down to the bottom to the events, and get on clicked or on pressed, on released. I mean, whatever you want to do with your button, you're going to need one of these events to fire off some execution when the player clicks on the button. Now, my suggestion when you're building anything that's a little bit complicated, like an inventory system, is just to go one step at a time. So the first thing that we want to do is when we have a button clicked, we want it to be able to spawn a specific item or actor in this case. So what I do is I take this item array here that we made earlier, and remember this has all these actors hard-coded in to be a specific thing at each slot. So what I'm going to do is say, okay, if you click button 1, which I called item 1 here, we want to set this integer variable that I made, and that's right over here. So this is going to pull out a specific integer from this array, so a certain index. So if I set this to 0, it's going to pull out the 0 index of the item array, which would correspond to item 1. You see this? So item 1 is the 0 index, item 2 is the 1 index, item 5 is the 4 index. So each one of these buttons is going to set this integer variable, which is then going to be used over here to pull that specific index out of this array. And then we're going to spawn that actor. So before we do any of this stuff over here, I'm just going to unhook this so that nothing is going to actually function past spawning the actor when you click on one of these buttons. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to unhook this so that all the buttons would be enabled to start with. So let me break that. And then I'm going to hit play. I'm going to bring up my inventory, and now you can see that all of the buttons are enabled, and if I click on one, it spawns that actor. But see, they're not attached to me or anything like that. If I click on the second one, it spawns something different, and so on. So that's good. This is the functionality that we want for that. Now, I'm going to go back in here and make this to disable all the buttons again. So now that we know that this is working, right, we want to continue on. We want to make sure that these things attach to our player. So initially, I was having right here, I was using the player reference that we created up here. I'm using it down here, and on the player, wherever you want to attach these actors, these items, you're going to get a reference to that spot. I literally created a billboard. I'm going to go into the player character right now and show you. So in the viewport, I just put this little billboard here, and that's this random spot out in the air that I'm spawning all the actors at and attaching them to the player. So back in the inventory, so I get my player reference, I get that random point in the air, I get that transform location, and that's what I plug into here in the spawn transform. But at that point, they're not actually attached to the character. So I do that over here in this part of the script. So once we spawn that actor, I want to get a reference to it because I want to do other things with it. And one of those things I want to do is actually attach it to the player. And that's what we're going to use this node for. But before I attach it to the player, because we want the functionality to swap things out and to toggle, so if you've already attached it to the player, we want to delete it, I needed to add some extra script logic in here, and that's what this part is for. So remember back here, we have an item index, and this is pulling out that specific actor, the specific item that we want to spawn. And what I want to do is make sure that we don't already have that actor spawned. So if you spawn the little cone or something, and you currently have a cone on you, I want it to delete. So I needed to make this branch to kind of check and see what we already have. So this variable, you already know, we're using here, and we're setting it here. We just hard code in what each button is going to set that index to, and that allows us to pull out the specific actor and spawn it. That's this thing. And I'm going to check it against this new variable that I created called current item index. Now, This one I've actually set by default to be -1, which means that it is a null index if you were to plug it into here, right? -1 is not going to show up in the item array. And I wanted it that way because the first time you spawn something, you don't have anything attached to the player, so I wanted to actually attach something to the player. So I have to make sure that the first time this goes through, it's false. If I left it at the default of 0, then if you actually spawn the 0 index here by clicking on the first item button, it would check that, you know, the item index is 0 equals 0, that would be true, and then it would destroy the actor. So this is some script that I put later to make sure that the actor, if we are duplicating it, so if you're clicking the same button again, it actually removes whatever's attached. So the first time you do anything, I don't want that to happen. So I've set this to -1 to make sure this always will be false the first time you run through. So now that we know that this is going to come out to be false the first time we spawn something, then I'm going to attach that to the player character with this node here, attached to component. And the target now is this item that we just created. You see how it's connected right here. And the parent is going to be whatever place you'd like to attach it to on your player. And I just put this random inventory placement billboard out in the middle of the air, so that's why all my things get spawned out in front of the player. Now, once we're done with that, I have this little bit of script here that says delete the current item. Now, we haven't used this variable yet. This is the first time I'm bringing it in. This is different. Notice I have a new item reference and a current item reference. So just like I have an item index and a current item index, we want to do the same thing with the actual actors that we're spawning. So I want to know what I've spawned and what I already have. You know, what I'm currently, when I click on the button, what's being spawned, and what, if anything, is already attached to the player. So that's what I call the current item reference. So I'm going to delete whatever is currently there. This is how you get that swapping out functionality. So if we spawn an actor, we set this variable as this is the new item that we want to have, and as long as it's not the item that's currently there that we used this check for, we're going to attach it to our player. Now, I don't want to attach multiple things, so I'm going to make sure I delete whatever was previously attached. First time you go through, this is going to do nothing because the current item reference will be null. As you see, I'm setting that over here. So what that means is we make a new item, we check to make sure that's not already on the player. If it's not, we attach it to the player, we destroy whatever was on the player. And now we're setting that new item to the current item. You see how this new item pin comes all the way down and around and goes up to the current item. So now what we just spawned, the new item, becomes the current item. And that's important for the next time you click on this button. And then I set the item index. It's the same kind of logic. You know, whatever the item is that we just spawned, which would have been set by pressing that button, now I'm setting it to the current item index. So by doing this, I now know what's currently on the player and what index that is. So if we walk through this again, if I click the first button, right, it's going to set this item index to 0. It's going to pull out the 0 index here from the get in the item array, which is going to pull out a specific actor. And in my case, that's child 1. It's then going to spawn child 1 at this location that I've set on the player, and then it's going to store a reference to that. Then we're going to check and make sure that the item index that we just spawned right here is not the same as something that we currently had already. If it is, we're going to destroy the current item reference, which would be the same thing that we just spawned. But the first time this goes through, it's always going to be false. So we're going to end up attaching this to the player. This will do absolutely nothing the first time, and then we're going to set this value. Current item is going to be what we just spawned, and the item index is going to become the current item index. So now, if we click this button again, we already have this actor spawned on the player. So now it's going to run through. It's actually going to spawn that actor again. But before you realize that it spawned that actor, it's going to run through here and check and say, what's the item index we just clicked? 0. What's the current item index? Well, we actually went through this once, so the current item index is actually 0 from the first time. So this is going to be true. It's going to come up here and say destroy current item reference. Now do you see why I set this after the destroy actor? I'm setting the current item reference because we went through this once, so now this was set to the actor we previously spawned. So now it's going to destroy what's currently on the player. And then I'm going to reset the current item index to -1. And the reason for this is, if you don't, the current item index is going to remain at 0, which means it's always going to think it needs to destroy the actor if you click the same button again. It caused a bug, so just remember that you need to set this back to -1. That way if you click 0 again, it won't say 0 equals 0 and then keep trying to destroy the same actor. So you reset this back to -1. It allows you to use that 0 index again on the third try, because now there won't be anything. 0 won't equal -1, and it'll spawn that 0 index actor again. Alright, I know that was probably a little bit complicated to run through, but hopefully you got it. If not, rewind or ask me another question, leave a comment. So that's how the inventory part works. Then we'll go into the player character here. Now in the player character, this is where you're actually creating that inventory widget. I have this hooked up to the event begin play right here, but I just moved it out of the way for clarity. So you create that inventory widget right here, and you promote this to a variable and store it as a reference, because we'll need to be able to communicate with this blueprint later. And then you add it to the viewport, but I don't want it to actually be visible in the beginning. I have a button down here, so when I push I change the visibility. If you want your inventory to always be visible, you don't have to worry about this part. But I start mine off hidden. And now when I hit the I button, it's going to set the visibility of the inventory reference that we just made right here. So we're going to go from hidden to visible. So when you hit I, you make this visible, and this is to help out with if you want to still be able to do things in the game. Like I want to be able to move around while the inventory was open, so you can set the input mode so your controller will still receive input and use it in the world when you're not hovering directly over your inventory. But if you are hovering over a button, it will use that input, when you click, to do something on the user interface in the widget. That's what this thing does right here. And when you hit I again, this is a flip-flop node, so the first time it's going to go through the A execution pin and make your inventory visible. The second time you hit I, it's going to go through the B execution, and that's just where I hide the visibility. And then I set the input mode to game only, so that you can't accidentally click on a inventory button or whatever. Honestly, this might be unnecessary, because once you hide the inventory, you shouldn't be able to click on it. Okay, and that's literally all you need to do in the player character. And the final part of this is your inventory items. So I'm going to go into the master item. And the only special thing here, outside of whatever functionality the poster has put in, is that for mine, like when you overlap that item, the way you keep track of having whether you collected it or not is to add it to that collected items array. So let me go back to the inventory and show you guys. But if you see in here, I told you we'd get back to this thing. This is just an array that I created, and when you first start out, it has absolutely nothing in it. It doesn't collect, you don't add array elements until you've actually collected them in the game. and this here in the master item is where you collect them. So when you overlap that item mesh, we make sure it's the player overlapping, and then because we created a reference to the inventory within the player, I can pull that reference out from this cast node here to access the inventory. So I don't have to create a separate reference or a cast to the inventory from the item. So I'm just going to pull it out from the player. And from there, I'm going to get the collected items array. And then I use this node, add unique, to make sure I'm not adding duplicate items to the array. So I only want to add them once. And now here in the master item, I've created two variables that are important. One is just to change the mesh. I mean, that's pretty basic. You want to have different looks for your items. So just when you start play, I have a basic item mesh that here is a cube. That's the default. But then I change that variable in the children by doing this set static mesh on begin play, and you make this a variable, and then in your child blueprints you can make it whatever mesh you want. The other variable that's really important is this item index integer variable. So this is something again that you'll be able to change in each child, and because this is what's actually going to talk to the inventory and tell it which item you picked up. So the default is -1, but when you go into your children, you're going to make it 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's going to correlate to the item that you've picked up. So once you overlap that item, it's going to come in here and find out what that item index is, which child you overlapped, and it's going to add it to this array in the inventory HUD. And then it's going to call this function that I made in the inventory called update buttons. So let me show you what that does. So I've gone over everything here in the inventory. The last thing I didn't do was this function that I made here. Hit the plus button here to create a function, and mine's called update buttons. So if you remember when we start out, you make this array, and I set all the buttons to be disabled because we haven't collected anything. So now that we collected something, so from this master item, we overlapped, we added that index to this collected items array, and then I call this function in the inventory. So now if we go to the inventory and look at that function, you'll see what it's doing. It's pulling out the collected items array, right? And then we're looping through to see all of the integer values that we've collected. And because of the way we've hard-coded in where the items are located here, if we collect, for example, item number 3, right, in the child blueprint, you would set the item index to 3. So when it goes into the inventory and the inventory looks through its collected items, it just reads a value of 3. And it pulls that out and it says get that button. So now it's going to pull out the third index of the button array, which is going to correspond to the fourth button, and it's going to set that enabled. And that's how these things become static, like the original poster wanted. So every time you pick up the third item, it's always going to be linked to the third button, for example. Never, even if you haven't picked up anything in the first slot, every time you pick up the same item, it gets mapped to the same button. And that's because of this. And that's pretty much it, guys. So I hope this helps the original posters. And anybody else that's watching this that wants to know a little bit more about inventories or how to set up some functionality for your game, just shoot me a comment or a message and I'll see what I can do for you. Alright guys, see you later.